Our next speaker is Randy MacMillan from Clear Springs Foods Incorporated, which is the largest trout company, certainly in North America, possibly the world.
Could be.
And they produce, what do you guys have?
26
About
million.
26 million pounds. They have one facility that produces more, that one facility, than the second largest trout producing state. So, and another interesting fact is that, is this it right here? So anyway, the other interesting thing is that Randy had an extension appointment
100 years ago.
when he was at Mississippi State University. So, and that's actually where we first met. So Randy's going to talk about the history, collaborations, and challenges of the Idaho trout industry. And
So why do some U.S. aquaculture sectors thrive and others barely survive? Why is it that some fish producers fail? What do you think are the essential elements that determine aquaculture success in the United States? Over the past 35 years, we've heard a lot about how aquaculture is the fastest growing sector of agriculture. That's probably true internationally, but certainly not domestically. Over the years, hopes for domestic aquaculture have been high and investment significant. Yet as a type of agriculture, we struggle. What do you think needs to happen? With imports accounting for over 91, perhaps 92% of seafood consumed in the United States, logic would suggest that domestic aquaculture should be doing well, since we obviously can't supply the demand. If only that were true. One obvious factor challenging our competitiveness are our higher costs for labor. So if we're to succeed, we have to figure out some way to mitigate for those higher costs. Are there clues that might help us better deliver value to our customers? As educators, I suspect you've thought long and hard, and clearly from what I heard this morning, you certainly have, thought long and hard about how to make U.S. aquaculture a success. And I can attest that some of you have spent, because I've been around a long time too, some of you have spent your entire professional career trying to make aquaculture a success in the United States. And I want to thank each of you for your expertise and your help in trying to achieve that goal. The fundamental elements of successful aquaculture are often identified in introductory aquaculture courses. I do remember, it's hard to think I could remember back then, but I do remember when I was an extension person in Mississippi and trying to educate catfish farmers about what the essentials, the fundamentals of aquaculture would be or are. Things like water quality, good feed, a market, health management, all very, very important for success. But given our struggles over the years, we must be missing something, or missing a lot of things. Gary asked me to relay to you some of the history and challenges of the Idaho trout industry. And that will serve as my easel to do that, but I'm going to add some color to the tapestry I present here to try to identify some other elements that, at least from my perspective, might be important for ensuring or helping aquaculture, domestic aquaculture, to succeed. So I will encourage everyone and you do this all the time, I'm sure, but think about why, what, and how. But also, as I go through the history a bit, and it's an abbreviated history, but as I go through that a bit, I'll ask you to think about, when you go home, what are the salient things, what are the poignant things in Idaho's history that might help domestic aquaculture to better succeed. So that doesn't work. That's what I was hitting. Which arrow key? This one. All right. So, but let's start with why. Why did trout aquaculture start in Idaho? So to begin our journey there, we have to look about 20 years before the time of the U.S. Civil War. In France, a couple of fishermen were actively engaged in fishing, of course, and they figured out that they could take wild brook trout and strip the eggs and the sperm from those wild brook trout and produce viable eggs, and then they could put them in some sort of an incubator, and they'd hatch, and then they could grow those fish out. So the interesting thing was that for the French government rewarded them by giving them tobacco stores. Makes perfect sense. But they publicized their efforts, and in so doing, they alerted a plastic surgeon in the United States. So one of the fishermen, his name was Joseph Remy. His friend was Antoine Chion. Don't try to correct my French; it's not very good anyway. So this Theodotus Garlic heard about this, and he tried to do the same thing. He took wild brook trout, stripped the eggs and sperm, and created viable embryos, some eggs, and off they went. And he wrote a treatise on this, a treatise on the artificial propagation of certain kinds of fish, with the description and the habit of such kinds as are the most suitable for pisciculture. Well, interestingly enough, in the United States at that time, there were some fairly influential politicians who had a eureka moment, an aha moment. They were very, very concerned about the failure of fisheries in the New England area because of pollution of the public waters. They were also very concerned about the loss of virility of men. They felt that because there was so much pollution in New England, men were becoming less manly because they couldn't go out and fish. So aquaculture became their solution. So they got some funding from the federal government, and the federal government sponsored a trip to California to try to spawn salmon, Pacific salmon. They had limited success doing that. But what they did find was that they could take rainbow trout and spawn those. At about the same time, there was a group, there were some international and statewide societies called acclimatization societies. These particular societies were interested in importing to their countries various exotic animals, plants, insects into their country to help them enjoy life. There was a fellow in New York who was just really enamored with William Shakespeare's plays. So he decided to import the house sparrow and the starling because those two birds were mentioned in a couple of Shakespeare's plays. And we all appreciate that fellow's interest or efforts these days. The point is that there was a great interest in in importing different kinds, non-native plants and animals into their countries, and that certainly was the case in the United States. There was a group called the California Acclimatization Society. They took hold of the rainbow trout, and they said, this is a wonderful fish. They ended up spreading, and some others as well, but spreading the rainbow trout, which is native to the Pacific Northwest. They spread that fish throughout the United States, and indeed it went internationally. So a sport fish industry was developed as a consequence of the spread of the rainbow trout, and demand for rainbow trout was created, and the beginning of the U.S. trout industry was spawned. Pun intended. So discovering how to artificially propagate fish, of course, led to the captive rearing of broodfish. In 1908, the first documented rainbow trout farm was built in Idaho. It was an egg station. It was established a short distance from Twin Falls, which is east of here, east of Boise, in a place called Devil's Corral. Well, that particular farm only lasted about 1 year. And about 5 years after that, another egg station was developed further east, even further east, in a place called Papoose Springs. In those days, natural light was used to guide spawning of captive broodfish. Today, thanks to photoperiod control, photoperiod manipulation, we can spawn the rainbow trout in Idaho year-round. And because of that, we have a constant supply of eggs, a constant supply of rainbow trout to go to market. And when you think about market demands, one of the things that aquaculture in general is supposed to do, or has the potential to do, is to supply a consistent product to the market year-round and hopefully at a consistent price. That doesn't work so much nowadays in terms of price, but at least for rainbow trout, but that's the idea. It was in 1924 in Idaho that the first trout farm was built in Idaho to grow rainbow trout for human consumption. By 1936, over 500,000 pounds of trout were being produced in Idaho. Today, Idaho produces, Gary, correct me if I'm wrong here, but about 40 million pounds on average of trout. It has gone down the past couple of years, and Kathleen, that's due to some disease issues that I'll speak to in a little bit. So Idaho produces 70 to 75% normal years, 70-75% of all the rainbow trout produced in the United States for human consumption. Idaho has very limited, and I can't think of any, but maybe there's a farmer or two that ships live trout for stocking purposes.
It's very small. It's insignificant compared to what's processed.
Right. This is water. So since the beginning of aquaculture about 4,000 years or so ago, people have used earthen ponds. And that's worked well. In Idaho, we started out trout farming in earthen ponds, and that was good. But sometime around the 1950s or so, cement ponds were introduced as serial reuse raceways. So water can come in, and I'll speak to this in a moment. Water comes, well, I can. So this happens to be a picture of one of Clear Springs farms. It's one I had ready access to. but water's coming in from up above here, and it goes from one raceway to the next, to the next, to the next. In this case, we use it 5 times. Use the water, reuse the water 5 times. And because of changes in elevation, all of this occurs by way of gravity flow, which is super. We don't have to spend any money for pumping water, and that's a wonderful thing. So because of this, the adoption of this type of production system, we've been able to, over the years, increase our production capacity dramatically. And I can't say exactly how much we've increased, although nowadays we produce about 40 million pounds. So in Idaho, it was what I'd call visionary entrepreneurs, kind of like Leo Ray, who you'll hear about at lunchtime, but visionary entrepreneurs who started the trout industry in Idaho. But the most fundamental why of trout farming in Idaho is our water resource. So the Idaho trout industry thrives in south central Idaho. That is a semi-arid, some people would call it a desert, depends on the year. This year was a bit wet for us, which is good, but also we had flooding. At any rate, it is a semi-arid area. We get maybe 8 to 10 inches of rain, of water a year from precipitation of one type or another. And it's our water resource that we use for growing the trout is because of what is the Eastern Snake Plain Aquifer, the ESPA. This is a very, very large underground aquifer. Aquifers are all underground. But it's a very large bathtub of water about the size of Lake Erie. And because of its geologic history, that being that we had millions of years of volcanic activity that laid down layer upon layer upon layer of basalt that fractured over time, that created this bathtub that we call the Eastern Snake Plain Aquifer. And coming from the aquifer are springs. On the southern side of the Snake River, or no, the northern side of the Snake River, on the southern part of the ESPA, we have these net by gravity, these great big springs that deliver drinking water to wherever, to the Snake River. And this picture here is from about 1908 or so. It's black and white up here. This area is called the Thousand Springs. When you go to Hagerman tomorrow, you'll drive by what used to be called, well, it still is called Thousand Springs, but you won't see a Thousand Springs anymore because a lot of the water has been appropriated for other things than natural spring flow, but also the aquifer itself has steadily declined in the amount of water that's in that bathtub. So the the spring water that we get is the perfect temperature for growing rainbow trout, 15 degrees C. It comes out of the aquifer. It has drinking water quality at 15 degrees C. Rainbow trout thrive extremely well at about 15 degrees C. The water comes out. It's typically saturated with dissolved oxygen. So we have 9 part per million or so dissolved oxygen to work with. We do have limits on how much oxygen we can use in the water because we have to discharge to meet state standards, which is 6 part per million oxygen. So that gives us our sideboards for how many pounds of trout, so to speak, we can grow. And oxygen, after water, everyone recognizes, oxygen is the first limiting factor for aquaculture, for farming fish. The ESPA is the largest aquifer system west of the Continental Divide. So trout farmers capture the spring water and channel it into our fish farms. And we have, I'll speak to this a little bit, we have water rights that enable us to use non-consumptively that water. So we have a lot of fresh water with water quality ideal for rainbow trout farming. We have innovators and entrepreneurs willing to take risks, some of whom are strategic thinkers as well. And we have the ability to artificially propagate captively reared rainbow trout, in part due to scientists unraveling the biology of trout. And as fish farmers, the next fundamental question is what and how do we feed the fish, and at what cost? In the early days of trout farming, various innovative methods of feeding were developed. Early on was the use of maggot pots. Everyone's familiar with maggot pots, right? No. So the idea was that people knew that that trout eat insects and larval insects, and so why not put above a pond a pot that has holes in the bottom and stuff it with things that insects would eat and lay their eggs in. And that worked fairly well. Not much production capacity with that, but that's what they started with. Then sometime in the 1920s, 30s, the history is a little bit vague on this, they started grinding up dead cows and dead horses and feeding them to the trout and other waste from slaughterhouses. But it wasn't until the advent of manufactured feeds that the trout industry in Idaho really took off. So sometime in the 1950s, manufactured feeds were developed, and we had some, I'm not sure who was really responsible for that, but one feed company in Idaho called Rangan's was instrumental in bringing that manufactured feed to Idaho trout farmers. People like Leo Ray may remember that. I'm not sure, Leo, but. So in that feed revolutionized rainbow trout production. So a further innovation that we're able to see increased production capacity as a consequence of that new type of feed. That and the scientific determination of the nutritional requirements of the trout. And that process, that science, is still being developed. So how you feed the fish is also important. Back when we had maggot pots, kind of a no-brainer, you stick stuff in the maggot pot and you have the maggot pot suspended over the raceway. Some of that idea is still there. Some innovators developed demand feeders. Rainbow trout are, like most Idahoans, very talented. They can learn very easily. So they know, once they experiment a bit, that they can knock a wire bar of sorts that hangs down from this cylinder that has feed in it. They will knock that bar and feed will drop down into the raceway and they'll eat it. And that's great. That's what, I don't know what portion of trout producers use that, Gary, but I think it's a fairly good number of trout producers. But then there's a new technology that came around, I think in the 80s or 90s, and that's this cable vase system. Again, this is a Clear Springs trout farm. These fellows are grading fish, but this cable vase system delivers small volumes of feed many times, like 100, 200 times during a day to a raceway of fish. And the thinking is that more evenly distributes the feed to the fish. You don't end up with getting vastly different sizes of fish in your raceway. And if you think about what the market's demanding consistent quality but consistent size of a product. at least our customers, Clear Spring customers, demand that. So with the cable vase system that we use, we see greater consistency. It's not perfect, but it does tend to reduce the amount of hogs out there. So I would suggest that with these certain developments, we're into the golden age of rainbow trout production in Idaho. So with these innovations in the 50s and 60s, we saw a dramatic increase in the appropriation of water devoted to trout farming in Idaho. Product demand was good. People coming out of the Korean War were anxious to find work or start their own businesses, and a local workforce was anxious for success and found it in the Idaho trout industry. In 1954, in the United States, the cost of a gallon of gas was 22 cents. The Dow Jones high was 381 points. Average monthly rent was $85. Elvis Presley began his music career in 1954. Father Knows Best was one of the most popular, people like me remember that show, but was one of the most popular TV shows on television. And mass vaccination of children against polio was begun in 1954. 1954 was also famous because on one particular day in 1954, April 11th, 1954, was voted the most boring day in the 20th century. There just wasn't any news. 1954 also is the year the United States, or the U.S. Trout Farmers Association was founded. Trout farmers have always been very competitive, actually cutthroat competitive historically. Oh yeah, that's a joke. I was thinking more, they were really mean to each other. That was a cutthroat I was thinking about, not the cutthroat trout. But they also recognized maybe there was value in collaboration, in working together, particularly to address various national issues and to even share ideas about trout farming. There is some rumor, and I wasn't very old at that time, so I didn't have any idea what trout farming was, but there was some claim that trout farmers were talking about markets and how to maybe say manipulate markets, I don't know, something like that, or adjust prices, something like that. I don't know. That doesn't happen these days, but there was some discussion apparently in the early days with the Trout Farmers Association about that. Okay, so in the 50s, 60s, more and more eastern Snake Plain aquifer water was being devoted to trout farming, and more and more innovation was happening. Oh, thank you, 2 minutes left. Okay, so innovation was happening. That was a good thing. It made trout farming more and more efficient. We had more and more things going on with processing. More mechanization was brought to the bear, or brought to the forefront, and that created more technically jobs that would require greater technical skills. So we were advancing to accommodate the newer workforce. So I have really gone longer than I thought, since I have 2 minutes or so left. And some of the challenges that the Idaho trout industry has had in Idaho. We've had issues with liver cancer in the trout. Back in the 1930s, liver cancer was identified as an issue, and that was, nobody paid too much attention to it, but it happened about the time when we shifted from a wet diet to a dry diet. Turns out that the more and more people started using a dry diet, we saw more and more trout hepatocarcinoma, so trout liver cancer. The good thing is there was no internet back then. There was no social media to broadcast this problem because that would have been a marketing nightmare. But people got together, the scientific community and the federal government, the private labs, they got together and figured out what was happening was there was aflatoxin in the feed, in the dry feed that was being manufactured. That plus they were using cottonseed meal that has gossypol. Gossypol doesn't cause liver cancer, but it potentiates the aflatoxin toxin. So through the collaboration of scientists, we were able to get through, oh, I skipped something. We were able to get through that, and the solution was just eliminate aflatoxin from the trout diet, and that issue of trout hepatocarcinoma went away. There are some other diseases out there. Enteric redmouth was a disease that would affect harvestable sized trout. Epizootics happened all the time in the trout industry in Idaho, and it caused 70% loss of fish. It wasn't until vaccines came along that we were able to get through that problem. And nowadays, enteric redmouth disease is rarely, if ever, seen, at least in trout producers in Idaho that use the vaccine. Gosh, Gary, you are... I was going to say at the end that you are a wonderful extension person.
You just did. You just did. Thank you.
Well, I'm going to change my mind and backtrack on that. So disease continues to be an issue in the trout industry. Water rights is a big, big deal for us. And in the West, we have to get a water right. In the state of Idaho, we have to get a water right to enable us to use that public water resource. And there have been battles about that. There's Mark Twain had a wonderful statement about whiskeys for drinking, water is for fighting. I can attest to that. Clear Springs was involved in a water right delivery call. We made a call because groundwater pumpers were using our water out of priority. And after 11 years in the water right war, and people actually threatened my safety, we got through it. We figured out, or the groundwater pumpers, their way to mitigate for their out of priority use of the water was to buy 3 other fish farms, give Clear Springs one, let us have a long-term lease for a second one, and then the third farm they are leasing to another farmer, fish farmer, who also had a water delivery call against the pumpers. The wonderful thing right now is that the groundwater pumpers, actually the state of Idaho, is investing very significantly in improving their water resource management. They're investing in recharge of the eastern Snake Plain Aquifer, and the groundwater pumpers and surface water users have reached an historic agreement that, which means that the pumpers will actually decrease their use of groundwater by 10%. This is from the eastern Snake Plain Aquifer. And if that's insufficient to stabilize and recover the aquifer somewhat, they will make additional reductions. That is historic. As far as other challenges, if I can just have a few more moments. It's just your break. So we do have environmental stewardship. Speakers already have spoken about the importance of environmental stewardship. That is a big deal for Idaho trout producers. The rainbow trout turns out to be extremely sensitive to toxins. The reason the trout got hepatocarcinoma was because it is such a sensitive animal to toxins of all sorts. So we value the lack of pesticides in our water, for example. We value the lack of pesticides in our feed. We also want to convince consumers that the Idaho trout industry is a good steward of the water resource and of our discharges. In 1990, the Middle Snake River was declared water quality limited by the state of Idaho. The reason for that was because of nuisance level aquatic plant growth. That triggered for the state, and was triggered by the Clean Water Act, to do something called a total maximum daily load. I don't think in Mississippi, where I got my extension roots it from, that TMDL is probably not part of your equation. But in Idaho, it's a big deal. And what it does, it ultimately limits the amount of phosphorus that trout farmers can discharge. Well, we went through some really head-knocking experiences trying to allocate amongst ourselves, amongst the trout industry, primarily the trout industry, but catfish and a little bit of tilapia down in the Thousand Springs area, a limited pot of gold. The limited pot of gold being how much phosphorus can aquaculture discharge to the Snake River. We had really serious head-knocking times there. We got through that. We solved that problem, and we thought we were, as we went into the next round of MPDS permits, everybody's familiar with MPDS? Okay. Our discharge permits, that we were going to be fine. Well, a short time ago, it was determined by EPA primarily, but our state Department of Environmental Quality as well, that the wrong amount of water in the river was used to calculate the assimilative capacity of the river. So we've started our head-knocking experience, again, not internally within the trout industry or aquaculture industry, but certainly with some other elements out there, NGOs out there, and we're just starting that process to figure out what's going to happen. Our next meeting actually is next Tuesday, I think. 13th. The 13th. So that's a big deal. So I ask you to always think about what or why, what and how, but also look at the history of the different sectors that you look at, that you work with, the different aquaculture sectors. When I looked at Idaho's history, there were a couple things that really stood out for me. One was that the heart of our success has been certainly continual innovation, but also collaboration. Collaboration with the Extension Service, with outreach specialists, with the state, and even with the regulatory agencies. Oftentimes they can be our friends. They have a job to do. They have to apply federal or state law, but they in large part, they want us to succeed. We ultimately commercial enterprise pays for their salaries. So they do recognize the value in having aquaculture there. So that was one lesson that I picked up, but the other was that change is inevitable. Shift happens. So the challenge for fish farmers, for those that are actively engaged in the commercial enterprise of fish farming, we have to recognize when change starts to happen. It is critical. If we're going to take advantage of changes that happen, we have to know early enough to make our own changes so we can take advantage of that opportunity. Change can also be detrimental. And I look at fish health as a place where a change in fish health, it can be very detrimental. And if we as fish farmers recognize that early on, we have better chance of working our way through it, a better chance of finding a way, whether it's by vaccination, change in practice, better biosecurity, whatever it is, we have better chance of addressing that and better mitigating for a new pathogen or a new strain of a pathogen. And I know you're going to have Dr. Kathleen Hartman make a presentation on the commercial aquaculture health program standards. I really hope you will pay great attention to her, because I think, anyway, CAPS is a wonderful product that's come out from the NAEC and USDA as a way to create incentive for fish farmers of all types to have a better surveillance program, to better identify when new things are happening on their fish farms that are detrimental to the health of those fish. And at that, I say thank you. And thank you, Gary, for being so tolerant.
Thank you, Alan. We have a break right now. We'll reconvene.